Awesome. Thank you very much, Ahmed. And I'm really honored to be here with the group of panelists that we have here today. Just a quick update on the format. What we're going to be doing is going through short presentations with quick introductions of ourselves. And then we'll be going into a Q&A discussion and a panel discussion. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Like mentioned, I will be going ahead and giving a quick overview of my background. Then we'll be introducing Ranjan Patnaik, CTO of Clara Foods, followed by Matt Gibson, co-founder and CEO of New Culture Foods. And then finally, Mike Leonard, CTO of Motif Foodworks. And you'll be hearing more from these great panelists shortly. So I will jump right in. Can you guys see my screen all right? Oh, no. Okay, let me try that again. Just a second. Okay, cool. Can you see it now? Okay, great. Fantastic. Great. So as mentioned, I have a background in software design and retail analytics. And in 2017, I was inspired by really cellular agriculture movement through Clean Meat by Paul Shapiro, the Clean Meat book that was released in early 2018. Shortly after, I kind of learned about what can really take place with cultured meat, cellular agriculture, and also the acellular agriculture technologies. I started a podcast by the name of Cultured Meat and Future Food Podcast, interviewing key players in the space. So the company is called SVCMS Group, and we're known for several things, but we have 3 core products or items that we produce, starting with the Cultured Meat and Future Food Podcast. There's something called Global Life Science Professionals, and that's a meetup group that is spanning across 6 different cities throughout the world. And then finally, the Cultured Meat Symposium, which is traditionally an in-person conference that takes place in San Francisco. So a little bit about the Future Food Show. We started working on trying to figure out how can we describe the cellular agriculture technology to a non-scientific audience. So if you ever heard of Explain It Like I'm 5, we try to ask those types of questions to key players in the space. That way they'll be able to really bring new learners and people that might be outside of the scientific world into the industry. And now with that being said, we do try to kind of simplify it for a broader audience, but most of the audience comes from either a scientific background or from an animal welfare background. We have quite a bit of episodes, and you can see some famous and familiar names here, like Ahmed from Cell Agri, along with some speakers that have been throughout this panel earlier over the last couple of days as well. And so definitely check out the podcast if you haven't heard of it before. It's futurefoodshow.com. The next initiative that we work on is called Global Life Science Professionals. And this is, like mentioned, a meetup group where we host small in-person events at different cities throughout the world. And of course, since the onset of the pandemic, we haven't hosted any events, but we still do try to engage the community in those local areas. And here are just some of the kind of key focus areas that we are touching. And we'd love to kind of expand this out. There's nothing really in Australia or parts of Africa or even South America. And so we are looking to kind of grow the idea of cellular agriculture across different cities throughout the world. A quick example of what some of these events look like. Again, they're small, oftentimes hackathon style sessions that take place. This is an event that took place last year in Berlin, where we had folks talking about designing the future of food. And we use that term design literally with kind of teams getting together in different groups to come up with new ideas, and they pitch these ideas. So at the end of a 2-hour session, they'll kind of come together and, for example, say, if these future food products were available, how could we reach different audiences, either through marketing or distribution or whatever it may be. Quick note, we have Nina Buffy here on this panel, along with a few others. I think Gary Lynn is there as well. But again, very hyper localized. So this one was in Berlin. And here's just the last shot of the teams working together. And then finally, the Cultured Meat Symposium is an event that we've been hosting in person in San Francisco. And so the goal of the event is to connect industry together, but more specifically Silicon Valley investors to the startups that are in the space. It's actually in our corporate and company name. So the SV in SVCMS stands for Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley does have a very unique investor environment. And here is a group of our volunteers and our team members that we work with for the Cultured Meat Symposium. And actually, before I jump off, I want to quickly allude to something that Ryan Bethencourt said on the keynote earlier today. And it's a new project that I'm working on independently. And the illustrator will probably kill me for kind of sharing this early, but essentially what this is a future butcher shop. And so the idea is that we're putting together a children's book that does highlight future food technologies such as cell-based meats, acellular agriculture products, and also plant-based meats. And what we're looking at here is a butcher with two different types of meats, but no traditional meat. You have plant-based meat and you have cell-based meat. And so we're going to be releasing kind of more information about this kind of personal passion project that I've been working on here shortly. But with that, feel free to reach out to me. I'm really excited for this panel. And so I'm going to stop sharing and welcome Ranjan from Clara Foods to the stage. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now.
Yeah, once again, thanks Alex and Ahmed for the opportunity to be able to participate in this conference. Really was looking forward to it. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Ranjan. I'm the CTO of the company, and I joined the company about a year and a half ago. Most of my career has been in industrial biotechnology fermentations. And the idea somehow that we would be able to use a known technology as old as fermentation to be able to completely change the landscape of how mankind is going to be accessing proteins in the future motivated me to join Clara Foods. And as you can see from our logo, Clara Foods is into the business of creating egg whites, but minus the chicken. So we are a company that is bringing egg white proteins into the market at a scale and impact that is truly going to make a significant impact on how people are accessing not only nutritional proteins, but especially eggs. So that's the premise in which I will try to introduce some of the products and the technology we are developing. One of the things, as you all know, that the planet is going to be having 9 billion people, there's not enough proteins available. And we also know that animal agriculture leads to a significant negative impact on the environment and especially climate change. So folks definitely have moved on, our consumers' preference has moved on to looking at substitutes, and a lot of plant-based proteins are being developed to substitute that. But we also know that the animal agriculture concept is just not working well. But food is also very ethnic, it is very personal, and therefore taste and few functionalities of food is always going to be in the minds of many of the folks who have to make a choice between plant-based, animal-based, and that cartoon was excellent, Alex, the one that you just showed, that in the future butcher shop, people will make those choices, but food is very simple and very personal, and taste is very ethnic as well. So therefore, we believe in Clara Foods that although there are many substitutes and many ways, different types of protein will be coming to replace animal proteins, we are going specifically to ensure that the proteins that we are going to work will be the exact nature identical animal-free proteins. So therefore, that's why we are going after the fermentation platform to ensure that the proteins we are making is exactly the proteins that are there in the animals anyway. And that's exactly the proteins that most of us consume when we consume animal meat. And I'm going to change the focus a little bit, given that background. The egg is as fascinating as anything you can think about. I mean, often I would say the world runs on eggs. It's that the mankind uses 1 trillion eggs, 1 trillion, and is really driving protein in a subtle way that we take for granted. But the life cycle analysis of eggs, you can imagine the footprint it leaves is not necessarily the best. There are more chickens in the planet than human beings. And therefore the question is, can we really get this nutritional product out there without going through the chicken farming process? And that's what drives us to go after eggs. And although most of us think eggs as 3 things, right? There is a shell, there is an egg white, and there is a yolk. But obviously from a scientific perspective, it is the most fascinating thing when you break open an egg from every angle. A chef likes it, a scientist like me loves it. When you start unraveling the molecular basis of eggs and how this all has been put together, it is really, really extremely fascinating. And that's what Clara Food has gone in and started unraveling the world of eggs and the proteins that make it. And also truly very little is known about these proteins and how they work together. So our platform has enabled us to access these proteins at an individual level. And that has opened up functionalities and attributes that makes these proteins really unique. So that's why we decided to go after these specific proteins in our first generation of products. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Of course, you know, there are a few examples. There are a couple of proteins I want to highlight here. Some of them are iron carriers. You can always imagine, I've seen, especially in emerging markets and other areas, eggs provide so much of nutrition, without knowing why they bring it. There is iron-containing proteins that are antimicrobial proteins. And there are what we are now seeing, proteins, when you remove them out of the mixture of an egg and individually look at it, some of that amazing nutritional properties and really functionalities that would just wow you as a consumer. And we want to talk about one of those proteins in the next few slides. But before that, this is again very obvious, but I wanted to highlight here that the amount of impact that one can make by making egg proteins without going through the chicken route, but by the fermentation route. There are so many other aspects of the supply chain, like stability, traceability, sustainability, that gets impacted. Because now we don't have to go through the massive amounts of antibiotics usage, the farming of chickens in closed doors, and the environmental footprint of that. That's really something that we don't see when we consume an egg. But really, if you trace back how you consume that egg, the amount of environmental footprint you're going to put is amazing, and consumers are seeing that. And therefore, by enabling egg protein supply at a price point that is accessible, just like any other eggs, through a fermentation platform that Clara is developing, we're going to be making a huge impact across the board in the supply chain that goes beyond just eggs. The same, and some of these things has become very highlighted recently with the pandemic coming in, and there are, avian flu, a lot of things that you hear once in a while in certain pockets of the geography really addresses the question, are leading indicators in many ways that things can go out of control if we continue to consume 1 trillion eggs through the chicken route. And therefore, our platform definitely is enabled to come to at least disrupt, if not completely provide an alternative to that. This is the other slide where I would say that Clara has developed these financial models around Series B that we have done. As you can see, we are partnering with some of the key players in the business, in the supply chain. Certain companies are the world's biggest bakeries, some of them, and Ingredient is our partner, not only is a commercial partner, is an investor also. And that's how we have been able to move forward. This agenda that we have is to supply egg proteins as a true ingredient that can replace eggs and egg whites. We also anticipate developing additional capabilities because our discovery pipeline has proteins that are amazing. And some of these things would require, we're unraveling new functionalities that can go into the entire cooking space in a very different way. So that's all I had as a primer for the company and its products. We'll be happy to take any questions as and when Alex and Ahmed allows everybody. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm excited to dive into that a little bit more once we get into the Q&A. And Ahmed, correct me if I'm wrong, but as we go through the next two presentations, if you do have any questions, make sure you are putting them in the Q&A. I see some are already in there. If it's in the chat, we might miss it, so please put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to it as best we can. But with that being said, I'd like to introduce Matt Gibson, co-founder and CEO of New Culture Foods. And I think the last time I ran into Matt, we were both on our way to the IndieBio Demo Day. And so it was, I think, the demo day before that, New Culture had an actual sample of their product, and I was able to try a very, very early kind of experimental sample. And so with that, I'll let Matt take it away.
Thanks, Alex. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Awesome. Well, hey, really, really privileged to be on this panel with such a privileged company and to be as part of this conference. I think it's really great. And first thing I should say is to forgive my accent. I'm from New Zealand, as you can probably tell. So sometimes it can be difficult to understand. I learned that the hard way since being in the United States, but please bear with me. So as Alex says, you know, I'm from New Culture. I'm the co-founder and CEO, and we're a relatively young company. And I'll dive into a bit about what we're up to. I'll share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this. Let me just... Okay. So, you know, at New Culture, we like to say we're making cow cheese without the cow. And what does that mean? And why are we focusing on cheese? So to start with the latter, we're focusing on cheese because it presents a few unique problems. The first is that dairy cheese is extremely, as you can see here, unsustainable. This actually took me by surprise when I was first looking into this space a few years ago. Just how unsustainable dairy cheese is. If you look at this chart here, you see that dairy cheese is actually the third worst animal food product for greenhouse gas emissions, and actually not just animal food products in general. And it's much, much more unsustainable than any other dairy product. And that's obviously a problem. But what makes dairy cheese even more problematic is that not only is it completely unsustainable, it's that the current dairy cheese alternatives don't work. And what that means is that current alternatives are simply not good enough for a mainstream dairy consumer to easily switch over to. For a mainstream dairy consumer to walk into a shop and buy a sustainable animal-free cheese just based on its price and its taste and its function. Current alternatives aren't there yet. And it's our view that taking that fully plant-based approach, it's very unlikely that they will be, at least anytime soon. So why is that the case? Why don't current cheese alternatives work? And what other routes can we take to make a sustainable yet delicious and functional dairy cheese? So to answer those questions, it helps if I take you through how dairy cheese is made traditionally. It's a relatively simple process, but looks can be deceiving because it takes a long time to master traditional cheese making. But to take you through on a high level, you know, essentially how cheese is made is that we have our mammalian milk, and that's usually bovine milk, cow milk. And you take that milk and you put it through two key steps. One is acidification. And that's usually done with a lactic acid bacteria, or commonly referred to as starter culture. It's a bacteria that consumes the lactose in milk and produces lactic acid as a byproduct. And as it produces lactic acid, it lowers the pH of the milk, acidifies it. That's generally done for the more structured aged cheeses. For a fresh cheese, you'll usually take a direct acid method. And what I mean by that is you'll directly add either citric acid or acetic acid, i.e. vinegar, to quickly acidify the milk. Now, that's the first step. The second step is what we call the coagulation step. And that is where we take our certified milk and we add in an enzyme that essentially turns this fluid milk into a solid. And we call that solid curd. And curd is this magical, you can think of it as a precursor to cheese. From curd, how you treat it, how you age it, what you do with it determines really the cheese that you make. So you could age that curd with the right aging bacteria and make a Parmesan. You could make a brie. You could dip that curd into hot water, start stretching it, and make a mozzarella, pasta filata cheese. So curd is just a magical precursor cheese, as we like to call it. Now, the question we asked ourselves at New Culture is, what in milk allows this to happen, right? What in milk is the functional part that allows it to go through this cheese-making process and come out the other side with this magical curd that can make all these different phenotypes, if you will, of products. And very quickly, you discover it is the proteins, and predominantly the casein proteins. So in milk, you have two protein fractions. You have the casein proteins, which represent about 80% of the milk's protein fraction, and then you have the whey proteins, which represents about 20%. And whey proteins are globular proteins. They generally don't interact much with each other. They're found, if you will, in their individual form. And they're very different to casein proteins. So casein proteins are what we call intrinsically disordered proteins. So that's spaghetti. They're not found by themselves in milk. They're actually found in these structures, these balls called casein micelles. And a casein micelle, you can just think of it as a ball of protein. It's made up of 4 different casein proteins, alpha S1, alpha S2, beta casein, and kappa casein. And they're very, very unique structures. They actually give milk its functionality. They give milk its color. So milk is white based on how light reflects off casein micelles and fat globules. And natively in milk, they float around in a very stable suspension. And they have these negatively charged shells, and they essentially repel each other. And what happens when you go through that traditional cheese making process, you're essentially destabilizing these casein micelles, and you're allowing them to start to come together, stick together, and form a matrix of protein. And as it forms this matrix of protein, it entraps fat and other small molecules, and you essentially end up with a curd. So you can think of a curd as really just a matrix of casein micelles. Now, what this all means, not to get too technical, is that casein micelles are absolutely essential and responsible for allowing milk to become cheese. Now, not only that, they're actually responsible for all or most of the traits that we love about dairy cheese. So the functionality of cheese, the texture, a lot of the taste, a lot of the structure, all comes from the casein micelles. So they're this vital, essential ingredient. And the problem that plant-based cheese manufacturers face is that casein micelles, casein proteins, are only found in mammalian milk. And there's no real analogs quite like them found in the plant-based world. And you can really see here the impact of having casein micelles. As you can see on the column on the left, with casein micelles and plant-based fats and plant-based sugars, you still get all these key dairy qualities. And if you don't have casein micelles, then you don't. It's essentially that black and white. Now, what does that mean for us and for making a delicious, sustainable, animal-free cheese? Well, we know we need casein proteins in a casein micellar form, but we don't want to source them from a cow, right? We want to make a sustainable product. So how else can we produce dairy proteins? Well, what's this panel about? Acellular Agriculture. And that is what we're using to produce our casein proteins via engineered microbes that we grow in fermentation tanks. And what makes us a bit different is that really we take it a step further. So we don't just produce this protein and stop there. We produce the casein protein, we reconstitute them back into their functional form, which are casein micelles. We add in plant-based fats, plant-based sugars, and we turn it all the way into a product. And we're making, as a first product, mozzarella cheese. So we're making a mozzarella that is not only animal-free, is not only sustainable, but is lactose-free. Think about how many people around the world are lactose intolerant, right? It's cholesterol-free, is also delicious, and has all the functionality that you would expect from mozzarella cheese, the meltability, the stretchiness, the softness, all these things, as a result of us producing real casein proteins in a casein micellar form, we still retain in our cheese. And that's the beauty of acellular agriculture, right? Is that we get to improve current methods, current foods that we have. We get to improve them for a growing population, for a world that's much in need of efficient and sustainable food supply. So that's essentially what we're doing at New Culture. Of course, I can't talk about New Culture without talking about our team, commonly referred to as the Dream Team. And so really fortunate to have everyone here on the screen participate and work with myself and my co-founder, Enya, on making this amazing food product. And really excited to dive into this after these presentations and chat a bit more about key learnings and how else we can use acellular agriculture for improving our food system. But hey, I'll stop there, and thanks so much for listening.
Great, thank you. And I see some questions coming specific to the cheese making process. So we'll answer those after we get into the QA. So next I'd like to introduce Mike Leonard, the CTO of Motif Foodworks. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks very much, Alex. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I'd like to echo what Ranjan and Matt said about really feeling privileged to be part of this panel and to be speaking with you all today. And I'm looking forward to the discussion a little bit later. So Ahmed and Alex, thanks for inviting me. All right, let me get my screen up here. First, a little bit about me. I'm Mike Leonard. I'm the CTO here at Motif. And for your awareness, Motif is a relatively young company. We're roughly 18 months old. We were spun out of Ginkgo Bioworks about 1.5 years ago. Recently completed our Series A round. That was last September. So we're still in the early stages of building the company, but have some exciting technology directions that we'd like to share with you. A little bit about me. I've been in the food business my whole career, roughly 18 years. Half that time was spent working in the ingredient business between IFF and DuPont, which are now the same company. And the other half was spent on the consumer-facing side of the world between PepsiCo and Kraft Heinz. So I have a lens on the industry that comes from both the ingredient side as well as the consumer-facing side. My training is in chemistry and polymer science and engineering. All right, so Motif Foodworks, who are we? What are we all about? Well, at the root of it, we're an ingredient innovation company. And we like to think that we're here to unleash the promise of plant-based foods. And I think Ranjan and Matt really set it up well and have probably already convinced you that the world is hungry for plant-based foods. That's no question. It's also really not debatable that consumers aren't satisfied with what they're getting. I think the example that Matt just talked through, it's exciting stuff, Matt, too, what you showed. Cheese is a great example. There's such a gap between what consumers are getting versus what they expect. And the recent Yale climate change report shows that taste is the biggest issue, as Ranjan mentioned. 44% of consumers don't think plant-based foods taste good. And 67% of consumers say they would eat more plant-based foods if they tasted better. So I don't think we need much more evidence to show that taste has to be right. So Motif is taking a bit of a different approach to this problem, and we're taking a very wide technology lens on it. We're doing some very fundamental science and leveraging new technology platforms to help rewrite the design rules for food, to help us generate deeper insights that can give us more productive targets for discovery, that can help companies manufacture great tasting, more nutritious plant-based foods that people actually crave. Now, I think we all agree that we can do a lot better as an industry and have to do a lot better as an industry in making these foods perform better, taste better, first and foremost. So we'll talk a little bit about that approach in the next few slides. So really our hypothesis is that the reason that the gaps today exist between what consumers are getting versus what they expect is due to a lack of deep understanding of the physics and chemistry that really dictate the performance of ingredients in plant-based foods. And I have to say, over the last 20 years, the technology in plant-based food manufacturing and formulation has come a long way. I mean, you just have to look as far as food service to see the job that Impossible Foods and Beyond have done to really bring awareness and credibility to the whole plant-based movement vis-a-vis the plant-based meat products they've developed. But I think we can all agree we still have a long way to go. And we believe that lack of fundamental understanding and the lack of basic scientific knowledge of how to optimize those formulations is one of the reasons why we're kind of stuck at a plateau in many cases. So the toolbox that we've all been trained on in the food industry is really kind of a set of modify and mask tools. And we all use these tools and they're still useful. But showing here, sensory testing, we all rely on this, including focus groups and descriptive testing, you name it. We listen a lot to what consumers say. Flavor strategies to mask off flavors, formulation strategies, stabilization strategies that in many cases are empirical and not based on a strong understanding of the design rules that are at play at different length scales in the formula. And then processing strategies to, brute force your way into the right structure. All those tools are important, but we also know that bringing another lens, into this equation is critical. So we're bringing a deeper understanding based on sciences that aren't new, but the combination of them applied to food is a relatively new thing. Where we're generating deeper insights from consumer feedback using oral processing physics and a deep understanding of that. Cognition metrics are another tool that we're using to augment consumer feedback. Synthetic biology is a main focus of our innovation engine, and that's one of the reasons why we're speaking to you here today. And we have a partnership with Ginkgo Bioworks to deliver on that. And also soft matter physics and material science. So a lot of the challenges that we have to solve in food with respect to texture, and in some cases flavor, have to do with the basic understanding of the physics and rheology of how food performs as a material. So we're bringing some new thinking and some new expertise into the equation with these sciences. And these really help us get to root cause solutions and help us to design targets for discovery better. As I mentioned, we do have an exclusive partnership with Ginkgo Bioworks, and we're based here in Boston and co-located with Ginkgo. They're one of the world's foremost synthetic biology companies, as I'm sure most of you know. They bring a scale and automation capability to the challenge of finding animal-free protein targets that's really hard to match. The extent to which Ginkgo can screen biological diversity and quickly generate organisms in a high throughput fashion gives us a really wide aperture on the types of ingredients that we can develop and explore food functionality with. So we're interfacing that high throughput capability with the capability to measure functionality in plant-based food ingredients as well. So we're very privileged to have Ginkgo as our key partner. And we believe that synthetic biology is a critical tool as we advance the science of plant-based foods, and really in general, it's one of the key ways that we all as human beings can do more with less as we head into a future where resources are going to be even more constrained. So in addition to synthetic biology, which again is a key engine for our innovation portfolio, we're making investments in a variety of other areas to help augment and add value to the synthetic biology portfolio we're developing. And at the end of the day, this approach comes down to a holistic understanding of food formulation, right? Knowing that solving for an animal-free version of a meat or dairy protein usually won't solve the whole problem for you. There are other issues that formulators encounter, big issues in fat, especially with plant-based meats and dairy. The fat texture, the fat structure has to be right. Fat is a key agent of flavor. And so that's also a critical component to make sure you're pushing the boundaries on. So we see the importance of leveraging a holistic formulation approach and innovation engines that exist in a variety of formulation spaces, and not just focusing on synthetic biology exclusively. So we've established a network of partners, research partners and academics to help us advance both the science as well as the technology that we can apply. On the protein side, we already talked about Ginkgo, and And that food functionality work I mentioned, we're doing in combination or in conjunction with University of Massachusetts Amherst and Eric Decker's lab. We're also making investments in fundamental rheological properties, understanding fundamental rheology of ingredient formulations, specifically hydrocolloids and proteins. And we're doing that work in collaboration with University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign and University of Illinois, Chicago, as well as Texas Tech University. With respect to the lipid platform, we have partnerships in place with University of Guelph in Toronto, as well as Casein, to look at things like saturated fat replacements in plant-based meat and cheese, as well as fats that can provide marbling type structures in muscle mimics and plant-based meats in general. And finally, on the texture side, we partnered with University of Queensland on a deep understanding of oral processing physics of plant-based meats to really get at the multi-link scale impact of ingredient choices, how those translate into the consumer experience when a product is consumed. So we're innovating all across this continuum, and not just in the ingredient side. We're also going all the way to finished food applications, because that's really, the best way to bring the technology to life and to connect with consumers and to really show what's possible and how we can do our part to help advance the industry to make these foods perform better. So we are taking a broad lens on innovation in this space, and synthetic biology is a key part of what we do. Ultimately, our portfolio will consist of individual ingredients, some of which are derived from synthetic biology and fermentation, combinations of those ingredients into systems, and as I mentioned, whole formulations where we bring all the knowledge we develop in terms of these design rules to life in actual products that we could put in front of consumers and launch in the marketplace, really demonstrate the power of what our technologies can do. So we're very focused on plant-based meat, plant-based dairy categories today, and the ingredients we're developing will address those portfolios. So we are still pre-commercial. We expect to be commercial towards the back half of next year with our first ingredient. So it's a very exciting time to be at Motif. We're young and growing, and are really hoping to make a difference and intend to make a difference in this space in conjunction with the great work that you saw Ranjan and Matt talk about. It's a real privilege to be part of this community. All right, thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. We will open it up to the panel session now, and towards the end of the panel session, we will reserve some time for an audience Q&A, and we have had over 300 attendees join us over the last couple of days, and so I do see a lot of questions coming through the chat. So with that being said, if we don't get to your question, I apologize. Let's try to jump through this and answer as many questions as we can. Really quick note, Mike, I love how you said that you guys view food as material science in many ways. And so kind of connecting material science to food, I think is a very interesting thing that most people don't think about. Now, we as a team prepared together a couple of questions, and I want to give a quick shout out to Adam Yee from My Food Job Rocks, who's also at Motif, who helped us curate and design some of the questions that we have here today. So if you haven't checked out Adam's podcast, it's My Food Job Rocks. You definitely can't miss it if you search that. So with that, we'll jump into question one. And I kind of want to step back a bit from kind of like what we're doing on the production side and really look at the challenges. So what would you say are some of the primary challenges that acellular agriculture technologies or acellular agriculture startups are facing right now? What kind of barriers to entry exist? Is it a research issue? Is it a time issue? What are the big challenges?
I can jump in. Let me go first. Cool. So, I mean, I can speak from experience and speak from the point of view, which was not too long ago when we were a pre-seed company, right? A company that hadn't gone through any accelerator or investor funding. And I think what a large challenge for many companies coming to this field is going to be really displaying what your unique point of difference is within synthetic biology. Because I think all of us on the panel know that synthetic biology is not cheap. is a lot of capex, a lot of time, a lot of money spent to generate at the start pretty small amounts of materials, pretty small amounts of protein or lipid or whatever you're making. So it's getting to the point now where it's no longer enough to simply say, hey, we're a company that's making recombinant casein protein. Please give us some money. Because other players, more established players in the field, can start doing that. So you really have to display this different formulation or different protein variant or just something that really makes you stand out. Now, to do that, generally you need to have generated some material to be able to display this difference that you have. And that key bridge to cross generally requires money. So I think the importance of these accelerator programs like IndieBio for us was absolutely essential, providing lab space, the ability to de-risk or to validate your science before you go through that seed funding is essential. So I think that gap in being a idea or just a team versus actually displaying your unique proposition is a huge challenge and something that can be bridged, but there's definitely no easy feat. So that's the point of view I come at this from as a relatively early and young company.
Yeah, Matt, if I could build on that, in a similar theme, I agree with everything you said. And I think time can also be your enemy if you're not smart about setting up your portfolio. In addition to being costly, synthetic biology timelines can be lengthy relative to the time scale of growth in this industry and the attention span of stakeholders. So I think, coping with timelines and feasibility demonstrations that, you'd like them today to capture an opportunity, but you might not be there yet. I think that's a critical issue. And also I would say, with respect to targets, picking the right targets, do you have deep enough insights to really know where that differentiation will matter? Because it's a pretty expensive experiment to do. If you don't have a good hypothesis for, what problem am I actually solving here? And do I have good reason to believe it'll work? I think that's a challenge. So you really have to have great insights to be able to de-risk this. And from my view, it's always smart to have other types of technologies that you can lean on and not just place your bets in one location. But I think that time challenge and also challenging yourself to ensure your insights are solid enough and deep enough to really provide that differentiation.
Yeah, I think, if I just could build a little bit more about the other part of food is that it has to be pretty diverse and scale and cheap. Food cannot be exotic, food cannot be, especially for the kind of impact that we are trying to make, speed is critical, price has to be the cheapest. To make a disruption, to create an irreversible disruption in the supply chain, so that in our psychic, non-animal free or animal-free animal proteins becomes a part of our second nature. And to do that, you need scale, the line of sight for scale. And I would say fermentation, this is one of the reasons I personally like fermentation, is because you're taking sugars and ammonia, putting it together and created a beautiful organic protein. There is plenty of sugars in the planet that nobody wants to use, right? And then there is plenty of ammonia right there. Two nasty things. One gives diabetes, the other one is a fertilizer ingredient. Put it into a water mixture, baker's yeast or whatever. No, it's a very old technology. And I want to simplify it in that sense. What we are doing is actually trying to make an impact quickly and at scale that it is irreversible. And fermentation technology, and yes, synthetic biology is a great platform. And yes, it is expensive, rightly so. And therefore, trying to do simple things using old technology is the approach that we have taken. And saying, look, fermentation is 300 years or as old as anything. There is a massive amount of infrastructure of steel in the ground for ages. And all we're trying to do is create a valuable product out of sugars and ammonia. And that's where our approach has been, to keep it very simple. And we have been lucky enough to find a few value propositions of a few egg proteins ingredient that can truly make an impact at speed and scale that we look. So therefore, to me, the line of sight towards commercialization to survive the intermediate scales and the pressure of investors, the pressure of return. But it is better to have a quick death rather than a slow death. If the line of sight to commoditization at scale doesn't exist, there is no reason to start even. And that's why I would agree with you both were saying, Mike and Matt were saying, is that choosing the right thing to work on with a clear line of sight for commercialization is convincing that to somebody to invest is the biggest hurdle first.
Great, and we'll jump into scale and sustainability a little bit more. There was a question that or more of a statement that came in also related to challenges, regulatory challenges. And I think that is a nice way to bleed into this next question that we have regarding consumer perception. So what kind of insights are available for consumer perception? What kind of regulatory challenges are there? And I do have a prop. So I have a cooler here. And so in this cooler, I have some Perfect Day ice cream. And in this Perfect Day ice cream on the back, it says, in terms of the ingredients, we have non-animal whey protein isolate, right? And so I want to kind of use this as an example that, the products are already out there or will be there within either, this year, next year. We're getting pretty close to that. So what kind of challenges do we face, if any, with regulation and also consumer perception of these new food technologies?
I can jump in. So first of all, if you haven't tried Perfect Days ice cream, you should, but it's really good. It's delicious. But it's an interesting topic because if you think back to the GMO messaging or reaction in the 1990s, right? It's very, very different. There's huge fear-mongering and negative reaction to these transgenic plants. And even things that were just purely for good, like golden rice, that was purely there to give vitamin A. And we think now to Perfect Day, to Impossible Foods, right? There's been a change in consumer perception to this technology. And I think there's been a maturation of the idea in the consumer's mind that this is a technology that's going to stay with us. It's a technology that's proven safe. Time and time again. And it's also a technology that's been used for a very long time. So for us, like cheese is a very good example, right? As I went through that cheese presentation, that enzyme that you add to the acidified milk to make your curd is a recombinant enzyme. It's made via bacteria because natively it's found in the stomachs of calves. Now we produce it with synthetic biology. So we're just been more and more used to the idea of synthetic biology as a source of food. And I think there's a natural reaction from people that as they become more aware of it, as they become more surrounded by it, then they're going to get more used to it. And it's very vital, though, for a company to be very transparent and not black box the tech. So you just have to be honest about it. And I think from a regulatory point of view, I'm sure all of us here on the panel know quite a lot about this, but as long as you're really making the native protein, right? As long as you're making the same amino acid sequence as what you'd find in cow's milk, for our example, then generally you can have a pretty smooth path through the regulatory route. You're essentially creating the same protein. If you want to modify it a little bit, then it gets a bit tricky. But from a regulatory point of view, at least from our experience and our discussions, it's not as big of a hurdle as we thought it would be. And Perfect Days ice cream is a perfect example of that. They went through GRAS status, they got a no objections letter from the FDA, and we have ice cream now that we can buy that's creamy, delicious, and animal free. So what's not to like?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think for certain targets that you're looking at through synthetic biology fermentation route, there can be nuances in terms of how the proteins are secreted or expressed otherwise that you need to characterize pretty heavily and make sure you have a good dialogue with FDA. The primary sequence is critical, but sometimes the modifications, glycosylation patterns, et cetera, can provide some interesting wrinkles. So I think it's always good to stay close to the FDA and bring them into your discussions or whatever regulatory body you're dealing with. I agree that there's been a shift towards more acceptance of the use of technology in food. I think the baggage of what we dealt with in Europe a couple decades ago is still there, But I think the perception is shifting that technology isn't necessarily a scary thing. And to echo what Matt said, as long as we're transparent and authentic about the provenance of what we're doing and have our hands open, that's the key. And it's a general trend you see in the food industry, right? People want to know what's the traceability, what's the provenance of what I'm eating. I want to understand that. I think we as an industry should respect that and have the same attitude. So, mainstream, there's still going to be some hangups, but that, to me, that just underscores the need for us to over deliver on taste and benefits, so that this trade-off between, technology versus, wow, look at what I get for this. I think that raises the stakes for us to produce even better products that make it hard to deny the benefit. So.
Great. And so the next question we're going into is regarding startups working with incumbents in the space. So earlier we heard Ranjan speak about Ingredion partnering with Clara Foods to expand the protein portfolio. What kind of, how does this exactly enable the startups? And then on top of that, what else can these startups be doing outside of kind of expanding portfolios? Like, what other benefits does working with incumbents in the space have?
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that. Ingredion has been an amazing partner, right? For a small company like us that is technology focused, bringing ingredients that would disrupt a $1 trillion eggs industry, $100 billion industry. Partners like Ingredion save time for us. They give us open up the distribution channels, their applications development labs, and the power they get on the table to really make the ingredients that we are bringing a technology platform to life very quickly globally. And I think, to me, it is absolutely critical that in the race to launch the ingredients and make an impact, speed will matter, because new technologies will come in, people will forget this. Synthetic biology goes back 40 years back. We still call it synthetic for whatever reason. And people forget, new things come in. But the momentum now is such that speed will matter, cost would matter. And companies like Ingredion are great supporters of this technology that we're trying to market. And therefore, in my mind, at least in our experience, we are benefiting years and a lot more than just investments.
Great. Anything to add, Mike or Matt?
Yeah, I just to echo that, I think partnerships are accelerants, plain and simple. It's not the easiest thing to sell into a CPG development process. That can take years. So if you have the partnership at the right time and real commitment, I think that's the key to work on something together and bring it to market. That's always going to speed things up, and that's critical in this industry. So same thing is true on development of science and technology. If you try to do it yourself as a startup, you're likely not going to be successful. So being aggressive at recruiting partners who can help to rapidly develop the foundation you need to innovate, that's also critical.
Great. So we have a question from Patricia, and it's directed towards Mike. She asks, are you interested in interfacing with cultivated meat companies as well, whether it comes to taste, flavor, texture, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, our focus isn't on that space, but we have our eye closely on it. So I think the answer is we're always interested in that kind of thing, and it's an exciting emerging area for us. Just hasn't been a focus up until now, but no doubt it won't be long before the scale of those platforms gets to a point where it becomes a more widespread commercial opportunity. And I think right now we're focused on where we can scale most quickly. So, but that is definitely an area we have our eye on.
Cool. And the next question is directed towards Matt. It's regarding, it's from Christian. How far are you with making cow-free milk lipids? The fats are essential for the taste of cheese. And I think in your presentation, you mentioned that you're using plant-based fats, but can you elaborate on kind of progress?
Yeah, so casein is difficult already. And for a startup at our stage, we want to be pretty focused. Fortunately, although fats and dairy lipids do play a huge part in cheese, it's predominantly for the aged cheeses. Now, as we are focused on mozzarella, which is a fresh cheese, we can do a fairly good job with plant-based fats. And we can just stay focused on making recombinant protein for now. And further down the line, if we want to move into aged cheeses, we can think about making our dairy fats internally, or even buying them externally from someone else that's producing them. Because in 3 to 4 years down the road, there's going to be many, many, many other companies just within dairy making animal-free dairy products. So that's sort of the way that we think about that. And mozzarella is a $1 billion market, so we're not going to be exiting it and moving to other cheeses anytime soon.
Great. The next question we have here has been submitted. Are there any nutritional gaps between the reduction or the reductionist approach of bottom-up biotechnology production of egg analogs and a natural chicken egg white? And so, yeah, are there any nutritional gaps?
Well, I can, to the extent I can talk about that egg white. When you look at the proteins, we are making exactly identical proteins. And therefore, reconstituting the egg white back based on these proteins, we don't see any major differences. But of course, the yolk would be different, and that has to be developed separately using plant-based fats. But from an egg white perspective, at least what we are looking at is we don't see as much of a difference. But as I mentioned, the idea of creating an egg from a stem cell or from cellular agriculture, time is questioned. If we can take the top 4 or 5 proteins in egg white, and you can see that it is purely dominated by those, and we are making exactly the identical sequences and the amino acid profile wise. So therefore, at least in the case of egg white, we don't see much of a issue there.
Great. So the next question is coming in from Isaac. To what extent do you find investors and incubators that are supporting organizations motivated by social value and environmental benefits, animal welfare, or other issues, kind of like other than financial return?
If I can just speak on my experience there, because we went through NDBio, which is this fantastic accelerator in the Bay Area. I think all these new biotech accelerators are predominantly in it, right, for these the right reasons, which is improving the sustainability ethics of our food system or any other broken system that we currently have. But that just can't be it, because you can set out to make the most sustainable product of all time, but unless you're actually a good business with a good product that is building a great team that's making money, you're not going to have that impact. So you can have the best purpose you want, but unless you have a good business, you have an actual good business plan, and you can be profitable, you're not going to be able to cause the change that you want to cause. So that's always coupled, is you always have to couple, at least in the private markets, the sustainability and the impact versus, is this actually something that can sell? Is this actually something that can become a good business? So that's just one thing I'd say, is that there's always going to be this balance between the two, or the need for two of them to be there at once.
Great. We had another question. It's directed towards Mike, but I think it can really go for any of the panelists. And that's that, will these ingredients be sold as a premium due to higher cost structures? And what is really the best way to disrupt the current market prices for certain ingredients? Like, is it about scale? Is it something else? What is really the best way to get at it with cost?
Yeah, I think we think about it in terms of value and use to the consumer. When I think about an innovation portfolio and really trying to deliver on this promise to make plant-based foods people crave, it's about driving the biggest benefit you can. And I think understanding the extent to which consumers value that and adapting a pricing structure based on that is important, and that's something that I think we all do. But it's true that cost structure of food, and Ranjan, you mentioned it. I mean, the margins in food are not pharmaceutical margins, and when you're dealing with discrete tanks of material you're fermenting, the economics are very different from an ag supply chain. So I think scale is part of that answer. But again, I think we as an ingredient community need to do our best to drive the benefit to a point where it's worth paying more for, and drive scale like crazy. I think again, it's the only way, right? If we don't make these foods taste better, more compelling, we're not going to get the adoption, we're not going to get the repeat purchase, and all the benefits to the planet and to humanity we won't realize, right? So I think it all comes down to make the most compelling ingredients and foods you can, show that value and have that value monetized, and work on scale in parallel. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I think I totally agree on that, because if it is an incremental change is not going to last too long to go through this. It has, the functionality has to be that disruptive. It catches the attention of the big companies or the existing status quo. And therefore the investments to sustain that journey will come through. But if the vision is incremental, then I call it as a slow death. Essentially, it was not going to sustain, because there is cost structure of getting new ingredients, new technology into the game. And what we are finding, at least, that as I was mentioning, some of our proteins has nothing to do with eggs. It just happen to be egg proteins. But nobody can make that unless you break an egg and really look at that protein to make it individually. So that's what the amazing thing when I looked at this thing, I mean, as an example, insulin has been there for what, 40, 50 years now? People used to, sacrifice pigs to get insulin and get injected. So there's nothing regulatory here to me in that sense also, right? So people have been doing it today. Insulin is commoditized. In fact, I would say insulin is probably the cheapest pharmaceutical that one can find that uses synthetic biology, or the so-called modern terminology of synthetic biology, using fermentation platform. But the scale for food, as Maddie was saying, and the cost structure is an order of magnitude different. And therefore, the speed, and this is the right choices for us, and functionality differentiation very early on will make all the difference. And consumers will definitely stay behind that if they see that in there. And especially in this new pandemic world, as we all know, the supply chain is the whole question. Imagine that my grapes are coming from Chile. How many touch points are there versus a distributed system? And if you think about brewing proteins in microbreweries all around the world, I can get my protein from my zip code. That's how probably is a way to look at it in many ways. Yep.
And also, if I can just jump on that point. So those are echoing both Ranjan and Mike's comments, is that, to give people an idea about the scale that we need to reach, it's pretty eye-watering actually. Now, this technology, this platform initially wasn't designed for food, right? It was designed for like biopharmaceuticals. And to give you a real world example, and giving you a New Zealand example, obviously. So New Zealand produces 22 billion liters of milk, right? That's about 600 million kilograms of casein protein. Now, to produce that amount of casein protein would essentially need to utilize all the fermentation capacity globally that's there. All the biopharmaceutical fermentation capacity, all the fermentation tanks that you can use for microbial fermentation. And you'd have to use them at their full capacity at the best titers that have been seen in industry every day, 100% recovery. And that's just to match New Zealand's casein production. And here's the kicker. New Zealand only contributes 3% of the world's milk production. So that just gives you an idea of the real bottleneck here is going to be scale, is going to be fermentation capacity. And that's why there needs to be a groundswell of industry, of people, of new companies coming in to really tackle this problem, because we need scale to accelerate quickly. And we need to accelerate quickly because, we're in pretty dire straits from a global point of view. So that's the reason why I don't think this is going to happen so much overnight or in the next few years. I think there needs to be such a development, such an infrastructure foundation built for synthetic biology for food that unfortunately it's going to be a bottleneck for quite a while longer.
Great, thank you. So that's it for time. There's just one last question I'd like to just maybe one-word answers from everyone on the panel, and is innovation in the plant-based food space more likely to come from startups or established players, or both? So maybe one-word answer starting with Ranjan.
Two words, definitely startup.
Mike?
I think it's both. With the innovation with a big I is done with startups, and the route to market and execution, some of the established players can handle.
Great. And Matt?
Yeah, I echo Mike's comments. I think the innovation will come from startups, distribution from established players.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much, and special thanks to Ahmed and Geza for organizing this. I believe there will be a recording available, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the next session.